Good morning, everyone. I think we are recording. Yes, we are live. Mr. Barron, can you hear us?
Might speak a little louder.
Mr. Barron, can you hear us online? Or Mr. Reeves?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect, thank you. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning. It is 9:01 a.m. This is a meeting of the Zoning Ordinance Advisory Committee. Thank you for being with us. Ms. May, can we start with the roll call, please?
Chair Hampton,
Present?
Vice Chair Blair, is she on her way?
I believe she's going to be absent today.
Absent, that's right. We have Ms. Bagley here, and we have Mr. Hall.
Here.
Mr. Baring is online, and so is Mr. Reeves.
Good morning.
Good morning. And we're still waiting on Mr. McGregor. And
So, Mr. McGregor, are you online? Doesn't look.
and also Commissioner Fox.
So we have 5 members present, so we have quorum.
Yes.
All right, so we have one discussion item on our agenda for today, and the approval of our minutes. Ms. May, did we have any registered speakers today?
We did not.
Okay. And sir, are you here to speak on DCA 223-007 regarding the neighborhood stabilization overlay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. We're gonna have it briefed by staff and have discussion, and then we will take our public comments.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us.
Yes, thank you.
Can I ask one question?
Yes.
Do we need to elect a vice chair for the?
Thank you for the point of order, Ms. May. So we do need an acting vice chair in Vice Chair Blair's absence. Mr. Hall, would you be willing to serve?
Happy to.
Thank you. Are there any objections? Any objections? Hearing none. Mr. Hall, thank you for serving. And thank you, Ms. May, for a reminder on that. So we have Ms. May and Ms. Gillis here and our city attorney with us for city staff. With that, Ms. Gillis, I believe you are presenting our item today.
I am. I will share my screen.
All right, well, thank you all. For the record, my name is Andrea Gillis. I'm with Planning and Urban Design. I will be presenting this item today. It is regarding a code amendment for, specifically for the neighborhood stabilization overlay. It's item DCA 223-0017.
17 or 07? Thank you.
Thank you for that correction.
Sorry, I was reading off of my agenda. That's why.
Yeah. Is there a super delay usually?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Super
Welcome to the auditorium.
Yes.
Trying to go through.
Is that one going? Usually that one goes faster than that one.
Just working through some technical.
For our members online, we're not advancing on this side, so we're trying to get our technical delay resolved.
All right, so just a little bit of the overview. I think it's a pretty standard overview that you'll see. I'll go through the proposal, some of the background, the purpose. You'll notice that, and hopefully you saw in your case report, that it's a pretty lean and mean proposed amendment. So I'll go through some of the issues that we've found over the past, actually it's been a couple of years, but they've risen more to light in the past few months. And then some of the proposed actions and next step. So specifically, the proposed amendment is to 51A-4.507, which is the neighborhood stabilization overlay. And this proposed amendment is specifically related to the height plane and how height is measured. So we're just dealing with height today. There's a lot of other components to the ordinance, but specifically, I just wanted to address the shorter term issues, the more immediate issues that have arisen over the past couple months. We also plan to have a more comprehensive update to this ordinance, but that's going to take a little bit longer to get in place. So just a little background and history, this ordinance has been in place since 2005. It was established specifically for single-family residential neighborhoods and for established neighborhoods. It's sort of in the suite of conservation districts, historic districts, but it has a much more limited scope than those other overlay districts. The neighborhood stabilization overlay can address setbacks, it can address garage placement, it can address some things in the frontage, and it can address height, but there's a high bar, a high threshold to have height included within the ordinance or within the overlay. You need 60% of the owners of property to sign on to the petition to agree to limit height beyond what the base zoning already allows. So, and again, these are just specific to single-family residential districts. We do have 13 neighborhoods that have adopted NSOs in the city. There are 2 that are pending right now, 2 neighborhoods that are working on neighborhood stabilization overlays. One of them, it's been quite a while, but they've been trying to work on that. There's another one that recently started working on that within the past maybe year and a half. But as you can imagine, if you want to address height and you need to get 60% of the owners of property to sign on, it can be challenging to get those signatures on the petition. And I will say of the 13 that are adopted, since we are dealing with height today in the amendment, of the 13 that are adopted, 8 of those overlays address height. The other ones only address setbacks or garage placements, things like that. What we found over the past few years, and actually a couple of years ago, I was at a meeting for Forward Dallas, and we're in a neighborhood area, and they started talking about the neighborhood stabilization overlay. How can this be right? How can we have a height limitation? It seems like these buildings are being constructed way beyond that height. We did some investigation. Planning and Urban Design did. And they were in compliance with the code, the letter of the code, if you read the code in black and white. And so it kind of went quiet for a while. And then over the past few months, we've just been hearing more and more of these cases. And as I said, that there was a Board of Adjustment case just last month where a variance to the height standard was approved in the La Bajada neighborhood. So a lot of this, and through that discussion, if you wanted to go back on August 15th and listen, it's a couple hour long discussion about trying to figure out how height is measured. It's a very complex way of measuring height. And maybe in 2005, it made sense, but part of the purpose for this amendment is that it's just in today what we're seeing built, what sort of the expectation is and what people's idea of what this NSO does, it's just not meeting the purpose and intent of the ordinance. So we need to make some adjustment. And so this is an amendment that's been initiated by Urban Design. We've been asked to look at this. We also knew that going back and forth with different departments within the city, there was just a lot of confusion. And so we wanted to close the loophole on some of those things and tighten it up in the short term, while we also, like I said, understand that we need to look at a more comprehensive update to the NSO to update it to be a usable ordinance to meet the needs of neighborhoods today. So as I said, just trying to provide some clarity on the code amendment or on the code, and really to address these immediate short-term issues with the height. And I will point out too, we went back and forth how best to address this. This is an amendment to the base ordinance. So there's the base NSO ordinance, and then the individual neighborhoods, if they opt into an NSO or they opt to go with an NSO, they then can tailor an ordinance specifically to their neighborhood. Any amendment, we can't amend those individual ordinances. That would have to be an authorized hearing. We'd have to open that all back up. all of them have, if they choose to go with height, if they opt into the height option, then all of them have to address height in the same way. So we needed to look at how we amend the base district, or the base ordinance for the NSO. We are not amending any individual ordinances or overlays. So one of the first things that came up, and to be perfectly honest, this was a super eye-opening understanding for me, is where height is measured. So NSO uses the height plane. Basically, it's a slope. You get yourself a triangle, you stand in the middle of the road, looking 6 feet up. It's a whole convoluted way of looking at it, in my opinion. But there was this point of when an NSO establishes a height limit, that's the height of the vertical plane. So you've got the angle that slopes up until it hits, say, the height limit. We've got 20 feet, we've got 24 feet, we've got 27 feet. All of them have different heights. But the vertical plane is where, or the vertical line is where the height plane intersects. Now, where that occurs was very confusing. And we had a hard time. There was one case where the La Bajada neighborhood was like, it just doesn't meet, it can't meet the code. It can't meet our NSO. Well, what we realized when looking at it is that the vertical plane always gets measured from, as the ordinance reads right now, the text of the ordinance says that it gets measured from the front building line, which is the same as the minimum front setback. So in this case, it's 20 feet, or in a lot of these neighborhoods, it's 20 feet, regardless of where you put your building. In my mind, I read it, and if you notice in the diagram to the left, which is in the ordinance, has at the bottom, where the vertical plane goes up, is front build line. So in my mind, the vertical plane is where you build the structure, but that's not the case. It's the minimum front setback line, regardless of where you put the building. So what we found out was you could move, if you set back your building, you could move it out of the plane, which is what happened in this case in the image on the right, was that the building, they moved themselves entirely out of the NSO height plane. So we needed to close that loophole, because the concern was if residents went through all of this process to limit height, at minimum, we should make it work. Yes.
Pardon me, your diagram here shows measured to midpoint,
Yes.
but it's not the actual height of the building, it's a
No.
midpoint.
Excellent question, which this whole time that residents thought it was just the max height is X. It's 25. No building can go over 25. It's actually not that. It's height plane, number one, but two, it's the midpoint of the building. And it also, or the midpoint of the gable, and it also talks about a pitched roof, obviously. So what we're seeing now, which gets further impacted, is what we're seeing now is the type of development we're seeing all over Dallas is the flat roof. So there is no midpoint on the flat roof. So you're getting an extended heights out of some of these buildings. And then in addition to that, if you can move yourself entirely out of the height plane, then you're getting a significantly taller building than what you have in the surrounding neighborhood, which the point of a neighborhood stabilization overlay was to maintain some of that established and original character in the area. So this is an attempt to clarify some of that. What the proposal is, this is when it comes up on the screen.
Shannon,
Yes.
I just want to make sure the definition of where height is measured, that goes back to chapter 51A. Is that correct? So it's not something defined within the NSO, that standard measurement of height in our existing code. Is that correct?
Well, there's height plane is.
Yeah, I know, height plane is specific to NSO, but where that measurement is, the question of.
Oh, yes, the midpoint, that goes back to.
Just wanted to
yes.
make sure that that's.
Yes, exactly. So there's that other piece to it. Correct. So, the small tweak that we are recommending, the small adjustment that we're recommending in the definition of height plane is to clarify that that it's the intersection of the vertical plane from the front building facade, so the front of the building, regardless of where you place it, and not the line, whereas it is right now. And so at least it's not going to solve everything, because again, I think we just need a more comprehensive look at this and a redo of, is this how we're going to continue to measure height in the NSOs? But I think we need a lot more community engagement on this one. This one is to try to close that loophole where we can. It's not perfect, but at least make it more difficult to move yourself out entirely of the overlay. So that's the first recommendation, the first proposal. Yes.
Well, you use the word facade.
Mhm.
Is that defined in the development code?
I don't think it's defined in 51A.
But I think you need to define
Yeah.
facade, because different people are gonna look at that differently. I think this is a very good solution,
Mhm.
but you need to define facade. Is the facade, it's just simple, facade front of the building.
Yeah.
But I think because people can play games with that, particularly as you're seeing with this moving it back, I think it's a very good solution. Maybe it's a Band-Aid, but it works for me, and I deal with setbacks. And I dealt with this height measurement when I was on Plan Commission, and it was like, and we had the famous dirt skirts in
Yes.
trying. So I think if you define facade, the only thing I see missing there is the definition of facade.
Thank you, Ms. Backlund. Ms. Gillis?
Thank you. That's helpful. The second issue that we had, and this sort of goes in line with the building type that's being built. And we're seeing it a lot of, this isn't any one particular neighborhood, even outside of NSOs, we're seeing, a lot of where you have established neighborhoods, traditional neighborhoods, where we're seeing a lot of tear downs and rebuilds. We're seeing a lot of the, out of scale rebuilds to what has been existing. And I think a lot of the what I've heard from a lot of the neighborhoods, they don't have an issue with rebuilds. They understand that neighborhoods evolve, but some sensitivity to that, rebuilding the scale. So and I think this ties to what I wasn't here in 2005 when this was developed, but what I would assume is that, again, this was language that was carried over the exceptions language goes back to the base code, right? And how height is dealt with. So what I'm assuming is that, in 2005, we didn't have a proliferation of, the 3 and 4 story flat roof buildings that had elevators. So I think it probably wasn't imagined what was going to be built out, especially in the NSOs, where you're trying to address some of the existing context. So for right now, one of the issues is that we've seen is that because the exception language is included in there, so that it says if the district regulates height, single-family structures may not be built to heights that exceed the height plane, except structures listed in 51A and the rest of the code. So this is parapets, which can go 4 feet above, mechanical rooms, elevator, they can go 12 feet above the roof line. So we were dealing with one of in the case of the variance, with the mechanical room, the elevator structure, the building was able to go up to, 41 feet. So where the median height in that district was actually 13 feet. Now, there are issues with height and all of that stuff. So this is sort of across the board. We're not seeing, we're seeing it in one particular neighborhood right now, but we also know the trend and how the development pattern is going. So this is one of those things that I think the intent was, nobody seems to have any issue with a 2-story building with some additional structures with chimneys. but it's when we get beyond to the 4-story and thinking about the context there. So the recommendation that we're proposing is just to exclude those structures from this, the exceptions, and that it's just if the district regulates height, single-family structures, including structures listed in 51A 4.408 A2, but excluding chimneys, which Sarah reminded me that chimneys are included there and we should allow chimneys. So that, if you can get in a mechanical room and an elevator shaft and you still want to, it still all has to fit within that height plane and the height restriction. It's not to say you couldn't do it, but it just has to fit within that height plane. Which I think is more in tune with the intent and the purpose of the overlay. So it gets us closer back to that and what the original purpose and intent of the ordinance was. I think. Sorry, I'm on delay again. And that's really, it's those two relatively, I mean, they'll have an impact, but those two relatively minor amendments to the code that, I'm happy to answer any questions, have further discussion. But, obviously our recommendation is that we can move this forward to CPC for their consideration.
And can you just give us one quick recap? So the proposed changes that are included, because I know we have a lot of pages in here. It's really 2 changes. Is that
Two
correct?
sections, that's it.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Commissioner Popkin.
And if you would go back to the height, the last page we were just looking at,
This one? Yep.
the page before, there's a delay there. The last sentence, height is measured from the grade to the midpoint between the lowest eaves and the highest ridge of the structure. Is that consistent with what we recently updated for conservation districts and all other uses for height?
It's probably, this is just the standard code language. So it may not be consistent with conservation districts. So I'm assuming that was individualized language specific for a conservation district.
And so what we were considering to regulate height in neighborhoods previously, is this consistent with how we did that?
Are you speaking of the prior code amendment? That's
Yes.
considered? It's actually coming back to ZOAC.
Oh,
Yes.
okay, it's unfinalized, okay.
CPC remanded it back.
Which, and it will ultimately update, any change will update the last part of this. It will have a cascading update effect, but separate and apart, we still want to exclude the exception language.
Just making sure we're covering everything.
Yes.
Okay, great.
There's a lot
Good
of height,
presentation.
yes, no, it's true, there's a lot of height issues going on.
Ms. Bagley, and then members online, if you could raise your hand so I can see you. Ms. Bagley.
Okay, the parapet walls have always bothered me because we've even seen, rooftop patios, and then they make the covering off the elevator shaft or whatever.
Yes.
And so, but this would help control that. And
If they were
that's,
going to do that, that would have to all happen in the height plane, within the height plane. It couldn't go any higher than what's within that plane.
I'll wait till we make other comments, let them.
Think on Mr. Reeves' hands, and I'll say, Mr. Baring, your screen's flickering on me, so please speak up if you had a question. Mr. Reeves.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Gillis. A really good presentation, and I definitely understand the spirit and intent. And I think you guys have nailed it. I'm also reading that says staff reviewed the ordinance and recommends a comprehensive update to almost 20-year-old regulations. I know currently that an NSO cannot touch architecture. Would part of that update in the future, not for today, I realize, be to like where an NSO could specify that you have to have hip and gable instead of the flat roofs? Because I know that's what we did in the Elm Thicket district, and that everybody started building the 3-story like monster cube, 5 feet from the property line that were just dwarfing the houses. And one of the things we did is say basically no flat roofs. It has to be a hip and gable, which then prevents that 30-foot wall, looming over somebody, so it's going up 20 feet and coming over. So would that be one of the possible changes in the future?
Yes, absolutely. That's, we've talked about almost shifting it into a menu of options that neighborhoods could choose from, and that being one of them, for sure.
Okay, good.
Address the roof type.
Okay, and that was all. I had more of a comment than a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reese. Mr. Berry?
Yes, I'd like to just understand, I guess, a little more background on the way it's measured and why it's measured differently than base zoning. I'm having some flashbacks to a landmark commission project that took a very, very long time to get through, a little 3-unit building. And part of the issue there was the complexity of measuring the front yard setback. You had to physically go out and measure the distance of the building from the front yard at each building along the block. And I'm thinking of our permitting reviewers and how much they're bogged down with different things. We're discussing this with the parking issue right now. And I'm wondering why, like, it's not just, just a height, just a standard height, 25 feet, 30 feet, and what I guess the thinking is there.
So what I understand is that the original intent was really how the building, the structure, or any new structure related to the street. So what you saw from the public right of way, that was the issue. So it was, I think people felt originally comfortable with, if the building was lower in the front and increased in height as you went back, that was fine, because generally you would have a consistent street frontage. And again, like I said, just the buildings that we're seeing today just weren't being built in 2005, I think, when a lot of people were contemplating this ordinance. So it really wasn't anticipated what we could see. So I think at the time, and a lot of the neighborhoods that have included height. So you have to measure what the median height is. And if it's under 20 feet, you can go under a 20-foot height limit. If it's 20, or if it's 21, then you start at 20. So some of these neighborhoods could have gone down to 15 feet because the vast majority of them are all 1 story. So I think part of that too, the plan was to try to soften the vast difference between 1-story structures and anything beyond that. So I think it was just trying to soften the slope. But again, in 2005, not really imagining the types that we're going to see today.
Sure. And
especially in these where the NSOs have been established.
Yeah, that makes sense as far as kind of encouraging new builds that fit in better with the neighborhood. I guess my concern is just, not that this is a PD, but we've got a lot of complex zoning rules in this city that tend to bog down review times and bog down permitting. And I just think the more we can simplify that in general, and perhaps, an NSO is not the place to do that. I just think by and large, our mission should be to simplify, and perhaps that applies a lot more outside of the NSO, but I just get concerned when we have these kind of complex ways of measuring things. But I understand your background on that. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and we 100% agree with that. That will be addressed in the comprehensive update to the neighborhood stabilization overlay. That will need a lot more, we'll need a lot more community input on what components go into the NSO and really how it's developed too. Because as you were saying, people are going out and measuring front yards. That's what you have to do in an NSO. We have tools to be able to make that a lot easier. And I think we have updated ideas now about measuring height and making it much easier and more clear to do that so that we can still get the intended result.
Thank you, Mr. Berry. Mr. McGregor, did you have any questions? We're about, I think, gonna go to second round.
I do not, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted to make sure we're seeing a really big lag here. So Mr. Hall and then Ms. Bagley.
Oh, okay, and I apologize for my voice, it's missing today. Your amendment here, it doesn't really mention flat roofs. I mean, it says, from the lowest eave to the highest ridge. Is that may be the same thing for a flat roof.
Yeah, so we've talked about how, if you read this in black and white, it doesn't even mention a flat, I mean, how can you measure a flat roof based on what this says? So I think this will need to get updated, but we were not at the point that's going to take a lot longer. And I think we have to have those conversations. I don't think it was brought up. Flat roofs are still allowed, but up to capped at 20 feet. So you can still do a flat roof, it's just capped at 20 feet. If you want to go anything beyond that, then you have to have a pitch to the roof. So we didn't want to make that unilateral decision that every neighborhood may not want to consider flat roofs if they're done, because there are some flat roofs in some of these neighborhoods where you can do, it's a 2-story or it's a shorter 2-story that still works within the context of the neighborhood. So we didn't want to preemptively exclude that option.
And may I ask one clarification on that? So I see it also references 51A, essentially the height definition, which is number 47. Would that then give you the definition of how a flat roof was calculated?
It does.
Okay.
It currently.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I understand there's other conversations. I just wanted to Mr. Hall's point, as much as this is talking about how you're measuring on a sloped roof, since it then says C, paragraph 51A, is that then what gives you the additional information if you add a different roof type, but then met all the other requirements?
Right, the way the code is right now, prior to our previous discussion on amending height, the code says it has gable hip and gambrel roof is the midpoint, and then it has this domed, structure, and then it says any other structure is to the top of the structure. So that would be the flat roof. Yeah, be any other.
So Ms. Bagley, well, Mr. Hall, was that all your questions? Yeah.
I kind of have two here. One, if you're looking at, say, this flat roof house with a 20-foot height, but you get 24 because you get a parapet wall. The thing back, I wasn't on the Plan Commission in 2005. I did observe an NSO to totally blow up in development, which was Little Forest Hills, where they couldn't decide on a lot of things, but I guess my concern is always been in that measuring to the midpoint of the roof, because given the pitch of the roof, you could actually, we watched a lot of houses come through where you got a third floor because you pitched the roof, but you're only measuring to the midpoint. So this went way up past the midpoint. So I think you're beginning to address a lot of that, and I think this is a good solution for this problem that's in front of you right now.
Sorry, I'm reading the thing again. I think I may have a question. And any other questions from our members?
Including the exception structures, I've noticed that that's an issue in my neighborhood outside of NSOs, and I really appreciate that that's something that we're beginning to look at and evaluate. Is there any opportunity to evaluate that more citywide?
I think we are, right?
Right, so CPC remanded the height amendment back to ZOAC because do you want to explain it?
For members to understand, when we heard the item at CPC, there was a significant amount of conversation and community input regarding grade, which we did not consider. We had left the grade provision essentially as it was in the base code, and there were a lot of communities that were seeing issues with that. And so for that reason, and since this body hadn't considered it, CPC had remanded it back to us. So that's on our to-do list. So look for that coming back to us, and we'll be revisiting this discussion on height. I think grade is part of that.
So this could be incorporated into that discussion as well.
Yes. So members online, any further comments? Or I think I do want to follow up. Ms. Bagley raised the question on, is facade the correct definition? I will say I did go into 2.0102, our definitions, and building line does specifically say setback. So building line's not our good language, but is there other, I didn't see another defined language. So do we need to add a facade definition, facade line definition?
Facade is used all over the sign code and a lot of other codes. We use it a lot in the form districts, and it hasn't really presented a problem as far as what is a facade. Now, the question's really like, at what point do we want, like, which facade are we measuring? That might be.
And that was going to be my question.
Yeah.
You've got a outhouse and.
Well, that, or I can think of a, you know, and again, it's a historic district, so not the same, not relative to this, but is a porch the facade, or is the front of the house versus the front of the porch, which is the facade?
So a porch is defined. We had this we had this conversation in another neighborhood, not NSO related. And I was actually surprised to find that we didn't have
Facade.
defined. But I always just take it for granted. Obviously shouldn't be taking code for granted, and definitions. But I believe what we had talked about is that porch is defined. And because porch is defined,
Porch is defined in that PD.
That PD, yeah, it's not.
forget that.
Or again, to Ms. Bagley's point, houses that have the offset that is, you know, a significant offset, which is it the closest facade? You heard right.
Well, we'll have to look at that. I mean, I think so we use it in the form districts. I think we'll have to look and maybe refer to the form districts or.
I would defer to the form district because you've got a definition there that's been
Yeah, and
generally working. I don't want to slow this down because you needed
yeah,
to do that, but I just think that it's going to be confusing if you.
We check the form district.
Yeah, I'm in there too. Let's see if your Wi-Fi is faster than mine.
There's no definition of facade by itself in form districts either.
Okay, so there's not one to defer to.
but we seem to be.
We didn't
using
use
it
that
more.
much when we did when we did all the form district stuff, and I don't remember
Yeah.
facade. It was all Bill 2 line and all
Right.
more of that.
The form district primarily talked about it for like transparency and facade articulation.
But it didn't say
It's like, it's
that
not
much
really,
facade.
yeah.
I mean, so what do we have something, if we're not? So we would, I mean, obviously, we can't just define facade in the NSO, which wouldn't be it would be, so then we have to open up the entire code for a code, it would be a separate code amendment.
I think we could add it at this point,
I think you could.
but
we've
it
only.
could be overarching.
So, well,
More impactful than we really.
Yeah.
It messes.
so what I'm seeing in form-based code is it says front building facade, facade area, street-facing facade. I was just trying to see how we used, if there was additional language that would clarify the intent. Primary street facade, side street facade. Yeah, it's used all over it. Yeah.
And I think we did have a short conversation about which facade, because, you know, like you said, if it's a 1-story facade at the very front and then you have a 3-story building, 10 feet away, that's just another loophole, So I don't mind the idea that it's all the facades, maybe even you have multiple height planes. Because the point is that you're trying to hide it behind that front facade. You know, you're trying to mask that the building is taller in the rear than it is from the front. So you kind of do want to have this height plane from all the street facing facades. It seems, I would think. It just makes it a lot more complicated, but you know, if you want to
Should
get design.
Should it be primary building facade with that?
I mean, I think we would, yeah.
It's meant to address it from the front
From
of the
the
building.
front.
It's about the front.
And so we have front, I mean, it does.
Yeah, it says
says
front property.
From the front building facade. I mean, I feel like that's, I mean, even if you put a snout house in, we do want you to measure from, because that's gonna put it even closer.
Right.
So that's gonna lower the plane potentially. So,
That's out.
oh,
And when they're
or the
offset.
garage is up.
Some
Oh.
people forward.
Okay.
So, that's the technical term.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds like we use facade pretty commonly in other areas of our
I
country.
just caution because there've been different things where, well, everybody knows what that means. And
And
that,
then we don't.
I caution on that.
Well, and one of the things that it's in the case report and I haven't mentioned is that we'll also need to, what we will do based on CPC recommendation is we need to update this diagram. So the height plane diagram, and we could provide some, you know, detail about front facade in the diagram to further
Yeah, yeah.
illustrate.
You did it in the diagram, I think, then you
Yeah, you
Yeah.
give an additional.
So we can
clarity
add
to
that
the
in,
intent.
that, exactly. So, yeah, so what we would need to clarify, obviously, is the front build line would need to be adjusted, and then it just needs to be updated.
Further discussion, members, or if not, do we have a motion?
I will make a motion,
Ms. Bagley,
in the matter of whatever the number is.
DCA 223.
In the matter of DCA 223-007, I recommend we go to CPC, the staff recommendations for the changes, subject to the facade exhibit being updated. Or the plane exhibit being updated.
Is there a second? Oh, Mr. Hall, thank you. Discussion,
Would the,
Mr. Conklin.
thank you, would the, image be updated for the next body approval?
We can do,
And for my clarification, what is that exhibit called?
Height plane diagram.
Height plane diagram. Okay, so we have a motion by Ms. Bagley, a second by Mr. Hall to follow staff recommendation to move the item forward to City Plan Commission, following staff recommendation, including an updated height plane diagram exhibit. Okay, any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you all. That is our agenda. Oh, and we have speakers. My apologies. I've been sitting here very patiently as we've gone through all of our discussion. We have no registered speakers online, but we do have, and ma'am, I think you've just joined us. Are you here to speak on DCA 223? Okay. Yes, sir. And thank you, Ms. Bagley, for the reminder. I'm getting ahead of myself this morning.
Good morning, y'all.
Good morning. If you
Thanks for
can
allowing me.
start with your name and address.
Oh, my name is Ronnie Mestas. MESTAS, 3215 Rutz, RETZ Street, Dallas, Texas, 75212. I'm the neighbor to La Bajada, and I'm not speaking for La Bajada. I'm just been working in the community for over 10 years. I am the chair for an organization called Vecinos Unidos that helped put that overlay in that area. I think two of the most important parts is if you're reading this NSO and you're reading it by the letter, it's confusing, you know, the letter of the code. But what the intent was back then, and it is today, was to preserve and protect that neighborhood, you know, stabilize that neighborhood. And that was one of the tools back then, or the only tool available for that. And then now it's just been wiped out, really. And with these amendments, a lot of the planning has been going on with Forward Dallas the last couple of years, and other vision planning that we've been doing in West Dallas. It's like anytime that something's made available to help our community, the city can come, and the city, and these are all the different departments in the city, because none of them talk to each other, can come and just wipe out, you know, and we see it as wiping out, because now you got $1 million home, $80,000, you know, well, the $80,000 house is now 200, but it's still an $80,000 home. And then that's was the purpose for the overlay, was to stabilize that community. And I think one of should be added that is like in some of the other districts that are conservative, like water conservation districts and things like that. You have to be aware of where you're moving into. You know, you just can't come in there and play dumb. You know, the builders know what they're doing. These are experienced builders that have been building for years. They're not coming in there and just pot luck. These lots are small, so the only way they can get their money out of it is to go up, and by just pushing the building back a little bit. Now you still, even with that drawing you had, you can still see that point of that mechanical room. You know, wherever you measure from, it's above what it was intended for, the tent. You know, of blocking. You know, everybody wants a view of downtown Dallas. West Dallas has one of the best in the whole city. You know, you just look right straight down from my street. I can see the arc, I can see the buildings and everything. So it's just the intent, and you know, we just need a lot of help with some of these codes. You know, that they just can't come in and amend something, or somebody find a loophole and do away with it. You know, that's you know, they need to be aware that's what they're coming into. And that's new people or the builders, you know, because it's not an accident. And a lot of the representatives, well, I'm not sure who represented this family, but they're ex-council people, they're politicians or people that work for the city, because they know what's going on. They know how to get around it. So there should be a moratorium on anyone that leaves the city shouldn't be allowed to be a consultant or an attorney for a family like that, you know, that's coming into a new neighborhood. So those are just some of the suggestions that, you know, and again, I'm not speaking for La Bajada. This is my own personal opinion and what I see coming into my neighborhood. We have one-story buildings. Now, there's looks like a motel that's being built right next to us. And you can just see it, you know, and your code enforcement people, they're inexperienced. And then by the time they get adjusted to the neighborhood, they're promoted or moved to another area. So that's another problem. You know, you have inexperienced people measuring, you know, and by the time you get out there, it's already built. And now you can't take it down because it costs too much for the owner to rebuild. And I can understand that part, you know. So there's a lot to be said, but thank you.
Thank you for being with us today, Mr. Massis. And are you in touch with Forward Dallas? And are you in touch with the Planning and Urban Design Department as they're looking at the overall update to the NSOs? I think you may have heard that in our discussion today. We're addressing one component, but there's a larger review underway. Are you in touch with the Planning Department on that?
With the Forward Dallas?
But also I think the NSO update. Yes.
No.
If you could stay with us for about 5 minutes, I'm happy to make sure we get you that contact information. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mastis. Mr. Reeves?
Yeah, just maybe a point of order, since we voted before he spoke. Could we ask him if he agrees with what we did? Because if we didn't, then we should probably redo the vote or consider redoing it.
Something's better than nothing.
Okay, that's true. I love that.
I think it's going to be a larger discussion, hopefully, as this moves forward. So thank you, Mr. Reeves. So we have one other item, which is the approval of our minutes from August 15th. Is there a motion to accept the minutes?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Is there a second?
Go ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Bagley. So that is a motion to approve the August 15th minutes as accepted. Motion by Mr. Hall, second by Ms. Bagley. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So the minutes are adopted as submitted, and that was the end of our agenda for today. I want to thank staff and Ms. Gillis for bringing this on board, everyone for being here. And with that, if there's no other discussion or items for the body, being none, it is 9:51 a.m. and we are adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.